From destructive hurricanes to massive wildfires and catastrophic flooding, global warming is considered the defining challenge of our time. We'll take a look back at 2024 and hear from climate experts on their predictions for 2025.
Hello, I'm Mike Walter, and this is The Heat. '24 is on track to be the warmest year on record, according to the World Meteorological Organization. The group once again issued a red alert about the rapid pace of climate change, turbocharged by increasing greenhouse gas emissions. Industrial nations at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, known as COP29, agreed to fund $300 billion annually to help developing countries with climate adaptation and building green economies, but failed to address phasing out fossil fuels. Under the 2015 Paris Agreement, countries vowed to keep global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, but are we at the point of no return? To answer that question, let's bring in our panel of climate experts. Joining us from Idaho, Michael Dorsey is the chair and director of the Walton Sustainability at Arizona State University. And with us from Baltimore, Tad DeLay is an assistant professor of philosophy at Baltimore City Community College and the author of Future of Denial, The Ideologies of Climate Change. From Los Angeles, Amali Tower is the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees, and Changhua is the chair of the Governing Council of the Asia Pacific Water Forum. She is joining us from Chengdu, China. And why don't I begin with you? I mean, we talked about the Paris Agreement, trying to keep global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. According to the experts, 2024, it's probably going to be a tick above that. Is it still possible to stay within that range, and what needs to be done?
Thank you for having me on the program again, Mike. And all the scientific data knowledge telling us today, we already crossed the threshold 1.5 degrees Celsius, at least for now. 2024 proves the year that we are already living in the zone of crossing 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level already. Of course, the scientists are also telling us it's not too late in terms of actions. If we take more aggressive or ambitious actions to mitigate climate change, we still have the opportunity to return back to, that sort of threshold. And but if not, we're definitely already passing that one already. Globally, we're more looking at the threshold of 2 degrees Celsius, the target at this moment. But we all know if not immediate actions are taken, we are probably by the end of the decade, we're going to cross that threshold again as well. That's put us in a very dangerous threshold in terms of human lives and as well as our infrastructure and all the life support system on the planet.
You know, I was in China this summer quite a bit, and you see all of these green license plates. I mean, EVs seem to be everywhere. There's been so many efforts. Can you talk to us about what China's done in terms of reducing greenhouse emissions?
Absolutely. First thing first, China definitely on the track to deliver its Paris Agreement committed by 2030. We are already achieving the targets ahead of the schedule. And if you look at renewable energy, solar and wind, we already installed 1,200 gigawatts solar and wind already 6 years ahead of the schedule. And China's emissions definitely getting closer to peaking. That's another commitment. In the meantime, if you look at national policies, investment in terms of energy efficiency improvement, that has been really dramatic as well. Now, on the adaptation side, China definitely has been investing heavily in the early warning for all system, which is a UN agenda. Because we're already living in the climate crisis age, and very importantly, we need to have the capability to detect, observe, forecast, monitor forecast, and analyze the trends, but very importantly, to get prepared to respond. In a nutshell, China is on track to deliver its commitment. Now, together with the global community, we're looking into the next decade in terms of what more ambitious targets will be put on the table.
Michael, from extreme heat to record tornado outbreaks, the United States certainly has not been spared from climate change and global warming. As we transition now from El Nino to La Nina, how might that impact the weather, do you think?
You know, the transition in these processes is definitely going to exacerbate the problems that we're already facing. Right now, the climate crisis is really a multi-trillion-dollar per year event. It's truly, gigantic in its implications on ecosystems and on human systems. Costing something in the realm of $16 million an hour. So it's something that we've got to do at least three things to check. We've got to put more money to deal with the damages and losses that communities has already faced over the many years and indeed decades. We've got to put more sort of green lights for growing the renewable energy economy, and we've got to put red lights on slowing down the already slowing investments and growth in the fossil fuel sector. We've got to remove the subsidies and things from that sector to really supercharge the already formidable renewable economy that we are seeing unfold before our very eyes.
Talking about formidable, it's certainly a formidable issue right now. Amali, scientists predicting migration is going to increase as the planet gets hotter. In fact, a panel from the UN said over the next 30 years, as many as 143 million people could likely be uprooted because of what we're seeing with climate change. But you're already seeing evidence that that's happening now. Give us an idea of what we're seeing in terms of climate refugees.
Yeah, I mean, we always have a lot of predictions and they're very high. And every year, what we do know for sure are the internal displacements of people who are displaced due to weather-related hazards, climate change, what we call slow onset events as well, like drought, extreme heat, desertification, as well as storms, cyclones, flooding. And last year alone, while there were about over 6 million people displaced, but the key here is, Mike, that a lot of those people were displaced multiple times, which led to over about 20 million people then being displaced when you look at the repeat displacements. And keep in mind, this is happening to very vulnerable populations in the global south. So, for example, China had the highest amount of displacements last year. There have been years in the past, in the very recent past year, in the last few years, where people have been displaced by climate-related events even more than conflict. Now, globally, when you look at cross-border displacement as well, every year the number of people displaced due to conflict, persecution, and climate and weather-related hazards increases by millions. Last year, we had, or rather this year, I should say, we know that we're over 120 million people displaced. By 2040, the number of countries that are dealing with increased climate hazards will grow from 3 to 65 countries that are facing these extreme hazards, and most of these countries are hosting displaced populations. So, it's not, think about what's going on in South Sudan, and a lot of these people are fleeing to Chad, which is dealing with extreme heat, drought, desertification, livelihood loss as a result. Rohingya refugees are living in Bangladesh, which is incredibly vulnerable to cyclones, storms, flooding, on and on it goes. This is how this situation looks. So I would say that, here we are wrapping the end of the year. The human impacts of climate change have been felt by the most vulnerable and poor and populations that have contributed the least or nothing at all to climate change.
And Amali, I saw an interview with you where you talked about people leaving Somalia, which has had a host of problems, of course, war and famine and terror. There's so many different issues. But I think in your interview you said they just have no interest in going back, not because of all the other issues I just talked about, but because of climate. Can you talk to us about what you're hearing from people who have been displaced?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. When I first started this work, so I come from a refugee background, right? So I've been talking to refugees, asylum seekers, displaced people for well over 20 years now. And when I founded Climate Refugees, almost 10 years ago now, what I heard were a lot of Somali refugees telling me in other parts of the world they were not in Somalia anymore. And when I was talking to them about durable solutions, they were saying to me, there's nothing to go back home to. I have no livelihoods. The crops were failing even before we left because there are no rains. The temperatures are increasing. We hear from our communities back home that nothing has changed. In fact, it's worse. So you have to think about it in terms of, protection is not just a legal definition. It's not just a legal basis. How do people actually sustain a livelihood? How do they feed their families? Based on what? And then you have to think, Mike, how does conflict overlay and exacerbate these conditions in places that are deeply vulnerable, where populations are deeply marginalized, and where all of this is intersectional? There's nothing to go back home to, is what populations or rather Somali refugees were saying to me everywhere I met them. I would meet them in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in the Congo. It didn't matter where, but I would hear this over and over again. And it's not just Somalis, Mike. I've heard this from Central Americans. I've heard this from, lots of populations in Asia. So this is what the global landscape looks like right now.
And Tad, there's so many different layers to this. I was reading some of your book today, and one of the pieces that jumped out at me, and I'd like you to talk about it, you talk about the pandemic and the lockdowns and all these gas-guzzling cars off the roads. I mean, I looked at the numbers in the neighborhood of 17,000 airlines grounded during the height of the pandemic. And you think, okay, well, the emissions going down, this is really going to help. And then you went on to write this: to the carbon budgets, the lockdown postponed the apocalypse by 3 weeks, just 3 weeks. That kind of knocks your socks off. And it also illustrates just how big a problem this is.
It does indeed. It shows us just how much a level of change is needed in order to meet any of these goals. And it is simply not the case that we are able to do that with the current mode of production and the alignment of energy systems. Right now, 4/5 of our energy globally comes from fossil fuels. That presents a problem in terms of getting energy to people, and also fossil fuels are important for the Haber process that's feeding 3 or 4 billion people. But it's also the case that fossil fuels are worth $250 trillion, right? And that's just the minority that we can access with today's resources and today's price points. And so the problem is quite large, and the COVID-19 lockdowns showed us exactly what it would mean to kind of ramp down emissions at the scale needed. Unfortunately, instead of continuing that process, we bounced back in the next year or two. And as far as I can tell, the leading experts that are handling carbon accounting expect that we are plateauing or even still slightly increasing rather than dropping, compliant with Paris goals of 1.5 or 2.
So, Changhua, what about the sense of urgency? In November in Azerbaijan, we had the UN Climate Change Conference that's known as COP29. Industrial nations agreed to fund about $300 billion annually to assist developing countries with adaptation to building green economies. What do you make of the deal, and is that enough money? Are we moving quickly enough?
The short answer is no. I think the Baku COP29 demonstrated, even though, as we're talking about here today, there is an increasing climate crisis, people are suffering the tremendous losses there, but somehow politically, as reflected in Baku, there's not this sense of urgency to meet that demand at all. I think generally speaking, we've been edging forward a little bit sort of progress in terms of some little bit sort of money on the table. In reality, we are falling far behind. We are failing literally, collectively together. And that's a challenge, that's a problem. Yes, we talk about, the crisis, we talk about the sufferings, the losses and damages in real life, but somehow we just wouldn't be able to come together, put the resources and the minds and, to the level of ambition that's needed at this moment. So 2025, we're going to have a much tougher job to do in terms of how to mobilize the resources that's necessary in order to deliver the commitments we made already, not only through the Paris Agreement, but also through biodiversity, combating land desertification, among others there. If we do not wake up from this process, and we all know the conclusion, we definitely have to bear more losses and damages there, particularly in the south part of the planet.
Michael, at COP29, though, there was an agreement reached on carbon markets, making country-to-country trading and creating crediting mechanisms fully operational. But I think a lot of people don't really understand how that works. How will that work?
The carbon markets are certainly an important signal to the marketplace on about the value tackling the climate crisis, but they're truly a marginal marketplace. They represent, economic activities around checking the unfolding climate crisis in the sort of, billions of dollars on a good day. The real marketplace that we got to pay attention to and really scrutinize and really look and see scale and grow is the renewable energy marketplace. We're looking at over $1 trillion of a marketplace just in renewable energies for this year alone. We're looking at 16% growth just in this year. That's, really 175% more growth than oil and gas combined. You got more people working in renewable energy, particularly solar and wind in states like Texas, than you got working in oil and gas. That's increasingly becoming the trend. The carbon markets are a small, sort of marginal sideline activity. The real attention has got to be placed on renewable energy growth in the marketplace there, but also with things like storage and also energy efficiency. That's where you see the trillions of dollars as opposed to the tens of billions on a good day that you see over in the carbon marketplace.
And Ted, at COP29, they failed, though, to move forward on an agreement to phase out fossil fuels. Instead, the issue's pushed to next year, and as you point out in your book, it's kind of another sign of kind of denial. I mean, we have to address this now, and yet it keeps getting pushed off and pushed off. What are the consequences of something like that?
Yes, governments are not doing enough. What is needed is central planning, incentives to ramp down and state-backed limits on emissions, but those are not coming through. So what we're getting instead are feed-in tariffs or tax incentives for renewables, but we are essentially piling those on top of carbon infrastructure rather than using them to phase down fossil fuels. And it is important for people to understand that while we need an energy transition to clean renewables, if you were simply piling those on top of the carbon pile, that doesn't help the environment, right? What matters to the environment is the release of fossil fuel emissions in the form of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. If you're still releasing the carbon dioxide, but you're piling on top of that clean energy, the atmosphere is going to keep turning up, right? And it's important for people to understand what the scale of change is difficult to fathom. We are on pace now. We've done about 1.3 degrees warming, right? The last year was probably this year is going to be about 1.59 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. That'll probably come back down a little bit as the La Nina phase sets in. But we're pretty close to being over the 1.5 limit. And that's more than a third of an ice age difference. And we've done that in just the last 30 years. And so I really want people to understand that it is incomprehensible to think that we have done about a third of an ice age difference. And we're on scale to do a full ice age difference by the end of the century. And we've done that mostly in the last 30 years. And it's in the wrong direction from an ice age.
And you also point out in your book, it's easy to look at governments, but you point out that the New Climate Institute looked at major corporations and how their net zero and carbon neutral pledges were faring. And you point out that there's a huge gap between reality and marketing. Can you talk about that?
Yes, corporations at this point have an incentive to pretend that they are climate friendly, right? Most consumers will say on surveys that they care about whether or not corporations are ecologically friendly. And so we see more and more greenwash as corporations try to present themselves as aligning with a survivable future, right? BP is a great example of this that everyone knows because of the introduction of the carbon footprint, but actually quite a few corporations now have different ways of trying to think about this. Delta Airlines, for example, in 2020 set a goal of reducing emissions and quickly said that they would be carbon neutral going forward. This is again through carbon offsetting, like we were talking about with Article 6 a moment ago, where companies are essentially, companies like Delta, for example, is buying up a lot of land in Indonesia, the Philippines, and calling it even, essentially. And this doesn't actually work. It might change on paper who is responsible for emissions legally, but it doesn't change the actual amount of emissions in the air that are turning up the temperature.
So, Michael, how do we really affect change as we talk about all these different issues?
The way in which we're going to affect change is really continue to accelerate growth in the renewable energy sector. We've got a space there that's really going to provide the fast and scalable solutions that we need to get out ahead of this problem. That $1.2-ish trillion that we're going to see invested in renewables just this year alone is about $250 billion above where we thought we might land this year. Next year, we're on track for possibly as much as $2.5 trillion of investments in renewables. That is the space that is growing the fastest. That's the space that we've got to continue to accelerate. It's certainly happening in the global north, but increasingly in the global south. In places like Africa, Asia, Latin America, we're seeing huge new renewable projects come online. One of the biggest on earth has just come online in India, backed by Jinko Solar, the Chinese conglomerate. So we're seeing tremendous growth in renewables. We've got to keep that going, and that's going to be the thing that's going to hopefully lead us out of this catastrophic climate crisis that we're in the midst of right now.
And Changhua, we see that greenhouse gases a lot of times absorbed by the ocean. We've seen coral bleaching as a result. We've seen them devastated in many regards. What are the consequences for coastal communities as we continue to face this issue?
Well, besides the surface temperature rise, we definitely have also been experiencing increasing temperature warming of the ocean. And the consequences are obvious. We started to have more extreme, even super typhoons, hurricanes, and the consequences are dire. China experienced 2 major, we call it super typhoons this year. We call it Gami and Yagi. If you look at the losses, damages to the coastal infrastructure and people's lives, lives and livelihoods, that's really, really devastating. We are literally talking about in tens of billions of dollars of losses and damages already. And sometimes we're talking about $1 billion for each disaster. That's already sort of the norm of the day. And so global warming is happening, and there's a tremendous sense of urgency. So it's not just a land, but also ocean. And we definitely been disrupting very dramatically the Earth planetary system, and the climate system in particular. If we do not get the sense of urgency to address that, we're going to bear more and more increasing loss and the damages and the costs down the road.
And Amali, as she points out, it impacts land, it impacts the oceans, but it also impacts people, as you so eloquently pointed out. Now, the International Court of Justice has been tasked with answering if countries are obligated under international law to protect the climate and environment from human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, and if governments should face legal consequences for inaction. And they're hearing from representatives from 99 countries, small island nations, who are obviously being impacted, seeing rising sea levels that could wipe out their populations, want accountability. Let's listen to a little bit, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
Coming to the International Court of Justice, we are trying to find another way to get climate action that we need, that the IPCC says we need, that science says we need, but which so many countries, through political convenience and the power of fossil fuel lobby, refuse to take action on.
There's always often a disconnect between the people that make decisions and the people that are really on the ground, their everyday realities. And you see it play out here in these spaces. And that's why it's important for people like me who knows, what sea level rise means, what's frequent rain and unpredictable rain mean for my people and their livelihood.
Now, the court, if they have a ruling, it's basically going to be non-binding advice. But what does something like this do in terms of at least heightening these voices, would you say?
Yeah. I think we have to think about the fact that there has been a major uptick in climate litigation at the international, national, and subnational levels. So this ICJ case that the court is hearing right now comes also in the same year where the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is hearing a case about this and even had climate displaced populations come before the court and testify. You also have the European Court of Human Rights that's had a ruling this year that Switzerland has an obligation to stop combat climate change. You had the International Tribunal Law of the Sea that said that countries have a legal responsibility and obligation to safeguard the oceans. There are numerous national cases I could tell you about. One that was really deeply impactful was a French immigration case that upheld a Bangladeshi man's right to stay on the basis of his health and pollution and the climate realities that Bangladesh is facing if he were to be returned. There's a lot of things that I can say. And only a few years ago, there was the UN Human Rights Committee that heard or commented, I will say, on a man from Kiribati who had attempted to seek asylum in New Zealand. And what they very importantly ruled is that states have an obligation to uphold human rights principles and not return people to countries where they may face life-threatening conditions that essentially threatening their right to life. So where you have rising seas, where you have extreme heat, there are a lot of things we know that will actually threaten people's human rights at a basic level, but also can be life-threatening. So I think you have to look at everything that I just said, and there's so many more, that these are multiple tools we have to exert pressure. These are international, legally binding obligations under international law, under international human rights law. So it's not a question of binding or non-binding. That's really talking about enforcement. If you are not playing by international law, I think we are seeing bad actors come to light, and it's going to start exerting public pressure, which I hope and I think will eventually lead to political change. It might be a slow process, Mike, but it's an incredibly important one, and I'm very happy to see is also being driven by Global South actors.
And Tad, we're talking about courts. Let's talk about the court of public opinion. In your book, you write, will our descendants look back on the long 21st century as the great transition or the dithering? Right now, which one?
Right now, certainly the dithering. And it's interesting that belief in climate change seems to be able to go backwards even as the evidence rises. In fact, in the last 5 years or so, belief in climate change among American liberals has dropped from 72% to 60% in only about 5 years. So I think it is important to understand that as the changes ramp up, as the consequences become more and more undeniable, they yet in a perverse way can become precisely more deniable as people try to reconcile their relative comfort with the pain of others. And I also think that we should think, yes, piggybacking off what was said before, the refugees, the vulnerable, the people who would be displaced, who will not look like climate change refugees because it will be often internal to a country, are precisely those who will be hurt most and will appear invisible to the system. And I think that we've, certainly in the last year, have gotten a very immediate lesson in what it means to watch even the genocide of a people group such as in Gaza being live streamed, and yet people are able to simply ignore this. And so what kinds of horrors, what kinds of border sentry drones, what kinds of administered starvations and deprivations are on the future?
Changhua Wu, I'm going to give you the last word. We've got about 20 seconds. What are your predictions for 2025?
Very tough year, I think, politically in particular. We are, if not take immediate actions, we're going to fail together. But I do want to emphasize the sign of hope. I do feel China is in the right position, on the right track to deliver really transition away from fossil fuels, as well as increase energy efficiency, and very importantly, investing heavily in energy, early warning for all, not only domestically, but with the global community.
Well, it's nice to end on a hopeful note. Thank you all for joining us. That's going to do it for this edition of The Heat. We leave you now with powerful images of extreme weather in 2024. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.
I see a country on the move.
There's my opportunity.
Is it good to change so fast?
Yes, but it's a challenge.
We have one foot in the future.
But we never forget our past.
We need to talk to one another.
And listen.
More than 1 billion voices telling their stories. Rediscovering China, only on CGTN.
The world's currencies are more connected than ever before. The mechanisms that drive the economy are universal. Money moves markets. We explain these trends and show you how the cash in your pocket can have a wide-reaching effect. Because money makes the world go round. Global business